Phyllis Wheatley, as I said, was one of those poets that emerged who was an enslaved woman. And there is a series of poets during the period of slavery. Many of them found education. Many of them lived in communities in which they could work as artisans and had a certain level of freedom and access to knowledge and learning that they would even write poems. And there's a long history of them. And the anthology has a few examples of those writers writing about their experience as slaves. There's a point at which Phyllis Wheatley introduces a really complex question about her position as a black woman in America, where she asks the question about the validity of her connection with her faith. Remember when we talked about Alauda Equiano, who spent a certain portion of his time asking the question about Christianity and actually saying he was grateful to have been able to come into Christianity because of slavery. And it's a very complex and controversial kind of position because, of course, the Christian doctrine is saying that what has happened is this gospel of Christ has come to these people. What these enslaved people are saying is that if they did not experience slavery, they would not necessarily have encountered this Christian doctrine. Of course, this is demonstrably incorrect, obviously, because throughout Africa, even prior to the emergence of slavery in places like Angola, in places like Southern Africa, where Europeans already sort of entered those populations and had brought the faith, the Christianity to them, they were not enslaved when they embraced the belief system. But more sort of dramatically and importantly, one of the oldest churches, as old as the Catholic Church, and in many instances older than the Catholic Church, the early church, was the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church, we see the genesis of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, in fact, in the Bible, in one of the Gospels, not the Gospels, in one of in the book of Acts, where Philip baptizes the Ethiopian eunuch, who then returns to Ethiopia according to tradition to begin the Ethiopian church, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. Therefore, Christianity's capacity to enter other cultures and worlds did not demand the process of colonization, the process of hugely abusive and frankly unchristian principles to bring it to them. But of course, Whitley struggles with this question and asks the question, what is her relationship to this faith? The same question that Frederick Douglass asked the question. But all African Americans come to the point in songs like the Negro Spirituals where they say that whatever this faith might be, it judges the enslaver. It judges the enslaver for the problems that they brought with it. So it's a fascinating question. Okay, so there's Phyllis Wheatley, and we will always remember to pay attention to her work because many of her poems speak to the American society, the American Revolution. She wrote letters to George Washington. She wrote poems for George Washington. She wrote elegies for many, really many of the leaders of the fledgling American society, and she wrote challenging questions about slavery, questioning the validity of slavery and so on. And her life was complicated by the fact that she was enslaved when she was doing all of these things. The other poets who we must always is worth paying attention to. There's a poet called Paul Lawrence Dunbar, who is really at the turn of the 18th and 19th century, the 19th and 20th century, in fact. And Lawrence Dunbar was a tragic figure. He himself eventually died from the effects of alcoholism, but really is one of the great poets of America. Just simply put, he was one of the great poets of America, and was in an interesting situation. Remember what I said about form and the content. He wrote in what was called the dialect form. So he wrote in the Black American vernacular, but he also wrote in standard English. And he was a Georgian poet, a poet writing in the great forms of that period. And what was fascinating about Paul Lawrence Dunbar was he struggled and had some ambivalence about writing in this vernacular because it typically was read as comic. It typically was read as performative, but it was the most popular ways in which people liked to have him come and do his performances and so on. And he felt that his work wasn't respected. There's a line from Paul Lawrence Dunbar in one of his most famous poems where he talks about "I know how the caged bird sings." It's a line that was picked up um, by Maya Angelou later on, and she names one of her memoirs on it, and she's written poetry on it. But if you look at Paul Lawrence Dunbar, one of the fascinating things is his questioning of his experience as an enslaved, not as an enslaved person, but as a black person in America, and in it he's exploring the question of his enslavement, that is his imprisonment in this body that has not been given the opportunity for freedom. So there's another poet that we can pay attention to. Throughout that period, what I'm trying to do is to just give you some idea of some of the poets that you will run into, and they're worth reading because, of course, when we ask questions in the prompts asking about African American poetry, poets like Dunbar, Jean Toomer, who we've talked about, Conte Cullen, and Claude McKay, are all poets that are interesting. All of these poets have a great deal in common. What they had in common was that they were using poetry to speak to their experience, and they were drawing on poetic traditions. Langston Hughes was drawing on the blues. Paul Lawrence Dunbar would often reference the Negro spirituals. James Weldon Johnson, a poet in his own right, would reference the Negro spirituals. They were all drawing on what we would call the Black and African vernacular to create a poetics. And somebody like Claude McKay, who was born in Jamaica and became an immigrant into America and had a long and famous career as a poet, to the extent that one of his great poems, which begins, "If We Must Die," it's a great sonnet. That poem begins, "If we must die," and proceeds to beautifully talk about resistance and fighting. The irony of it was that that was a poem that was quoted by Winston Churchill as he was speaking to the British when they faced the Blitzkrieg, the German invasion that was being attempted, and he read that poem as a poem of resistance. Again, Claude McKay is a fascinating writer who wrote his poetry of the highest standard during the Harlem Renaissance, and was applauded and praised for it. But also struggled and suffered because of the lack of opportunities that came his way. He also moved towards a Marxist kind of thinking for a period, as many people did in the 1920s, many African Americans did in the 1920s, delusioned by American white racist culture. And of course, he traveled the world as a poet and being understood as a poet. There are a number of poems that we'll find in the collection, that in the anthology, that feature the work of Claude McKay. Again, worth paying attention to the way that he speaks of the African American experience, the Black experience, in the face of the oppressive nature of what we would see in this period of these writers that I'm talking about. What we call Jim Crow, what we call systemic racism in the society. So I want us to understand that along with the emergence of fiction and nonfiction, we also have the emergence of the poet, and the poet becomes really much a fixture in African American culture and African American society. And what becomes really interesting is the ways in which those poets recognize in forms like jazz and the blues, in the folk traditions, a poetic expression of the greatest level. Today, African American poets are dominant within the American poetry establishment, and that tradition is a long one that goes all the way back to, in terms of great names and understanding those great names, somebody like Phyllis Wheatley.